I'd like to start today's function. So I'm Shivaji Sondhi. Sitting next to me is my mother, Mrs. Madhuri Sondhi, and the prize is named in honor of my father, as many of you will know. The M.L. Sondhi Prize for International Politics has been handed out for many years by the M.L. Sondhi Trust, of which my mother is the chairperson. So today we are really delighted to be gathered for the award of this prize for the year 2023 to Professor Stephen Rosen of Harvard University. The award of the prize was somewhat delayed by international events. In fact, Professor Rosen was to visit India, and we were going to do this in person last October. And I think you all remember that at that point, international events took a turn. And because of the events in the Middle East, Professor Rosen was not able to finish his trip. So we decided that instead of waiting for another harmonic convergence of the planets where we could work it out, that we would instead ask Professor Rosen if he would be willing to do this online and give the lecture that he had already prepared to give last year. I won't say too much about him just because the Professor Pant and Admiral Menon also know him extremely well. But he is Professor of National Security Studies at Harvard. He recently transitioned to being emeritus, but as best I can tell, it has made absolutely no difference to his work schedule, perhaps increase the amount of travel that he does. Instead of giving him, as I'm very tempted to do, a big account of his career, I will simply read out the citation, just because I think it hits the high points. So the citation reads, "The Professor M.L. Sondhi Prize for International Politics for 2023 is presented to Professor Stephen Rosen of Harvard University in recognition of his distinguished career in research, teaching, and public service. He is one of the deepest analysts of military affairs of his generation, with an astonishing range of interests and expertise, from the details of weapon systems to the organization of militaries to the higher direction of war. This is reflected in his 3 landmark books, Winning the Next War, Innovation in the Modern Military, Societies and Military Power, India and Its Armies, War and Human Nature, and an array of other writings. In his career in public service, he has spent time in the Defense Department and the National Security Council of the United States government, and then continued to consult on a broad range of issues. He has also been repeatedly honored for his classroom teaching, and his extremely effective mentorship has been central to the success of young people who have spent time around him. Professor Rosen's career is unified by his conviction that the defense of democratic societies is a moral imperative." So with that, I will ask Professor Harshpant if he will take over the helm of the remaining part of our program. And Harsh.
Thanks, Shivaji, and let me start by thanking the Sondhi Foundation and Mrs. Sondhi, Shivaji and Vivek, who have over the last few years tried to help the process of actually recognizing and and in some ways also giving greater traction to the debate, to the discussions on international relations by giving this award to key players, key scholars, key voices in India, which is a rarity. We do not have any other prize as the best as I know of this kind in the country. So it's as a student of international politics, it's wonderful to be able to be a part of this process over the last few years. And it's always a pleasure to be part of such sessions, but it is particularly endearing and a privilege to be able to chair this session, where we are, of course, remembering Professor Admiral Sondhi and awarding this prize to a scholar who perhaps epitomizes key beliefs of Professor Sondhi himself, which is challenging conventional wisdom, pushing the frontiers of intellectual discourse in domains where long held assumptions hold fort and where it has been very difficult to push both the intellectual boundary as well as, in some cases, our assumptions about the way we look at the world. And Professor Rosen's scholarship, his work, has long forced us to challenge our long held beliefs, particularly, I think, on military affairs and the causes and consequences of war, on how the instrumentality of force shapes our understanding both of diplomacy as well as the conduct on the battlefield, which then impacts how international politics is structured, and key actors on the international landscape engage with each other. And this is particularly, I think, germane at this point in time when we are looking at at warfare and then the instrumentality of force bouncing back into public consciousness, into public discourse, perhaps in ways that are quite unprecedented, and I think a correction, of course, of some of the mistaken beliefs that we had grown used to over the last few years, that perhaps war is a matter which we can ignore. And as we are realizing today, recognizing once again that we can do so at our own peril, the way key events of international politics today are being shaped by the instrumentality of force and warfare. I think Shivaji talked about October 7th, where we are seeing Middle East, which has always been the theater of military operations, but suddenly this eruption. And of course, before that, the use of force by Russia against Ukraine, also again telling us that warfare and the ability of states and the willingness of states to use warfare as a means of conducting both diplomacy on the battlefield and off it remains particularly important for the way we look at the world. I think when we are talking about Professor Rosen and his work, Shivaji mentioned his key works, his the way he has shaped a generation's thinking on these matters on military affairs. But since we are an Indian audience, it's particularly noteworthy that his contribution, his scholarship on war and Indian military, which ignited a series of conversations in India and beyond as to how India and Indians, both scholars and practitioners, should think about the organization of our society and its impact on the military remains very, very significant. The work he produced on the subject contested a key neorealist assumption about militaries, that competition among states will induce them, at least in a functional way, to organize themselves in a way that completely eliminates internal differences of the social origins. Now, I think the argument that states do not merely care about their survival, but also display care about the way of life within their social units, has since then, of course, become commonplace. But it was Professor Rosen's work that allowed us to look at this, in a distinctive framework. Yeah, I think he expands on this theme by showing that militaries that are burdened or condemned to preserving internal order, domestic order, will always struggle to generate offensive capability. And that by showing that military effectiveness is determined by social structure of the country, Professor Rosen allowed, I think, as in India, to think that India, which had military technology that was comparable to European militaries during the 30 Years' War, how it suffered military defeat at the hands of the Brits and the East India Company. And that became, in that sense, a benchmark to understand why societies and how societal structures and processes continue to play that role, how the organization of militaries was reflected by that. And then I think the contemporary Indian Army, as Professor Rosen has also shown, remained isolated from its social origins or society at large, which resulted in its preventing corruption or allowed it to preserve its strength. Again, in some ways, showing how Indian militaries and its effectiveness since independence also is a reflection of the way civil military aspects were created and well structured. Now, I think what has happened since then, of course, that we have seen a lot of challenges emerge, both in terms of the structural elements of how Indian military has been facing external challenges in the form of China's rise, and also internal challenges where the structures have come into contestation, where there has been a very widespread debate about how do we structure internal military structures, and therefore we have had this long-standing demand, for example, of a CDS, etc., being met more recently, but also now this move towards integrated theater commands, which is now being talked about as perhaps a panacea for a lot of things. But how does that impact integration effectiveness of the military still remains to be seen. So I do think that as we look at Professor Rosen's work and as we look at the world around us that is changing, there are enormous issues that Indian military scholars and practitioners who think about Indian military and its role that it plays in India, and how we are looking at the role of perhaps warfare in the Indian context. There are a couple of things that are quite interesting. One, of course, is the whole issue of the internal restructuring that I was talking about, and in that sense, tri-service cooperation, which is now seen as a very important element in having effective militaries, in having the militaries leverage their capabilities more effectively, remains a domain where we are still seeing a lot of debate and a lot of discussion within the country. There is a widespread acceptance of the logic of it, but how do we operationalize it? That still remains a matter of contestation, and we have not seen, therefore, the theatre commands debate come to a logical conclusion. Although at several points in time in the last few years, we have seen that the debate seemingly coming to an end. The other issue, which I think contemporary scholars and practitioners have to recognize, is that the importance that war and capacity to wage it are not simply about capabilities, logistics, organization, objectives, and strategy, but equally about developing a symbiotic relationship between civilian decision makers and military practitioners. And I think that involves civilians understanding operational matters, constraints, and challenges faced by the military, and conversely, military also understanding civilian constraints. I think this relationship is very, very fundamental to the way how democracies are able to sustain support for their militaries. And there again, this is something that we need in this country to build. We need to think about how we can have civilian engagement with military matters that is not simply about the capabilities, but also about the substance of that engagement. That how do we have civilian participation? Do we have civilian expertise that can comment, that can debate, and that can take forward these policy conversations in a productive manner? And that is again something that we have struggled as a nation to develop that core competency. In fact, most of our experts on defense matters generally are retired military officials, and I think that creates a problem. That because again the relationship between society, between the civilians and the military remains underutilized, and that poses a challenge repeatedly in how we showcase what military does, and how the civilians and the societies respond. Indian society responds to that, to the challenges sometimes that emerge from the military. The final, I think, aspect is, of course, the integration of frontier technologies, which will, a range of that is visible now on the battlefield. What is happening, for example, both in the Ukraine theater and the West Asian theater, Middle Eastern theater, that and how that adaptability and that flexibility to adapt these frontier technologies into our doctrines and strategies and structures and processes. That I think remains a fundamental question for Indian military to think about, and which is being and for all militaries to think about. I think, especially in democracies, how do we think about the rapid adaptability, whole of society approach to governance and to military matters? I was in Taiwan recently, where the Taiwanese government is talking about a whole of society resilience approach to the challenge that China is posing. So I think, in that sense, this question of modern militaries fighting modern battles again remains an issue that is beginning to shape up both in India, and the way the use of force has suddenly become such an is, is, uh, is out there in ways that perhaps we were not looking at it a few years down the line. So what I think essentially Professor Rosen and his work has done is to make us aware of the societal challenges and the integration between societies and the militaries, and that perhaps fundamentally in the Indian context remains a very important matter as India looks forward to fighting the battles of the 21st century, as India looks forward to perhaps creating a deterrence structure that prevents and that would prevent from fighting those wars in a sense. So I think we look forward to hearing Professor Rosen's statement and presentation today on war and future of India. But let me first invite Rear Admiral Raja Menon, one of our most sagacious observers of Indian matters, of matters military and defense and national security, and hear him out. And I think here is thoughts both about Professor Rosen's his contribution, his work, as well as about the broader challenge of war and Indian state. Before I invite Professor Rosen for his remarks, Admiral Menon, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Harsh. Harsh, Mrs. Madhuri Sondhi, Professor Stephen Rosen, Dr. Shivaji Sondhi, and Dr. Vivekananda Sondhi, ladies and gentlemen. Very good evening to you from salubrious Bangalore, where I am now. The temperature is a balmy 24 degrees. I realize it's a little early for some of you in the United States, but let me say what a great honor it's for me to be asked to preside over this very happy occasion to honor Professor Rosen by the Professor Sondhi Foundation. Professor Sondhi, first, you must have read his biodata. He first attracted the attention, he came to my attention and the attention of the whole of India, myself included, when he first stood for election in, I think, 1967 to become a member of parliament. It was, of course, only much later that I learned that Professor Sondhi had earlier been a Rhodes Scholar, had topped the UPSC examination for the Indian Civil Service, and had given up all of it to pursue his dream. I realize now what principles were involved and the courage of his convictions to have given up a safe career, as many middle-class Indians would like to aspire to pursue his dream. I first met Professor Sondhi at a seminar in Delhi a little after I had retired from the Navy, and he was heading the International Council for Social Science Research. I remember being intrigued by the term social sciences, as one doesn't come across the subject very often in the armed forces. But I straightaway took to the great intellect and the warm-heartedness of Professor Sondhi. Harsh, if I may just digress a little bit to talk about my career a bit, just so as to explain what are the factors that resulted in my generation of professional military officers in thinking the way they do. My career was divided broadly into two phases. The first, of course, was hardcore Navy. As a pioneer in starting the submarine service, for which the Navy asked for volunteers. It's an entirely voluntary service. And then seeing it through the development of the submarine arm for 2 or 3 decades, many of us who were very young in the service were exposed early on to geopolitics and political uncertainty. We were sent to the UK for submarine training as we looked up to the UK just 15 years after independence for most everything and for training, and spending a year and a half serving on board as one of the crew in British submarines. All this didn't quite prepare us for the British Admiralty's decision to deny submarines to India at the end of our training. So the lot of us, a bunch of officers and men, were flown from the UK to Delhi for a month and then to Vladivostok as Admiral Sergei Gorshkov. He only welcomed India's request for submarines and anything else. Take what you will was his expression, with open arms. But while we were in Vladivostok, our eyes again were a little opened to the grim realities of life in Vladivostok, especially those of us who went with families and children. And we couldn't help but observe the large hollowed out portions of the former Soviet Union. And many of us, although we were not encouraged to hold political views, became quite skeptical about the USSR's chances of competing successfully in the Cold War as early as 1975. Sure enough, 10 years after operating Russian submarines in the Indian Ocean, Moscow blocked all efforts to transfer submarine pressure hull technology to refit those same submarines without India conceding to the USSR a naval base on India's east coast. So the Navy altered course, and I was sent to Kiel in Germany to oversee the building of submarines for the Indian Navy, the country having given up on operating Russian submarines. The deal included building submarines in Bombay, for which the deal was signed in very hard to get dollars. But this deal should have ended the turbulence in the country's attempts to build a navy. But it didn't. A severe devaluation of the Indian rupee made German submarines 300% more expensive almost overnight. We struggled with these difficulties until a dynamic prime minister opened up India's economy, as you are all aware, in 1991, after which India began to grow economically. This almost coincided with the breakup of the Soviet Union, which was followed by a dramatic visit to New Delhi of Admiral Chuck Larson, the Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Command, who, in a very frank address to India's naval hierarchy, admitted that Washington had been mistaken all along about India giving base access to the Soviet Navy on its east coast, the same place where I had served for almost 20 years. Indo-US naval cooperation started from there on. By now, my seagoing days were practically over. There was at the same time a very exciting atmosphere in Delhi under a brilliant young defense minister who was determined to shake up things bureaucratically. I therefore spent a year in New Delhi's first tri-service staff writing out a case to install a National Security Council under the Indian cabinet, imitating thereby the American system. But it took almost a decade for the Indian politicians to come to terms with the change in the parliamentary system to this American change. By now, it was beginning to dawn on me that in the 50 years we had been independent, we had perhaps not built up strong enough institutions to guide the government through complex geopolitical and military situations. But I still had to spend 2 more years teaching at our staff college in Wellington, during which time I tried to contribute a little to this efficiency and published my first book, Maritime Strategy and Continental Wars, which is still a current text in the Navy. But I must say that after retirement, life began to open up. A bunch of US academics and think tankers arrived in Delhi in the early 2000s to sell the idea of net assessment. Looking back on it, those days, retrospectively, I think Delhi could have benefited much more than it actually did. The armed forces embraced the idea of net assessment, but the Indian bureaucracy was still too mired in their own world. And what is more tragically, the Foreign Office didn't quite take up the idea. I was immediately smitten, and there followed a decade of interaction with the great Andy Marshall. The US system for planning for an uncertain world gradually became clear to all of us who participated. It was at this time that I first met Professor Sondhi and began to understand the utility of social sciences in strategic planning. I noticed that Professor Rosen is also a veteran of net assessment in the US. Looking deeper into Professor Rosen's CV, it becomes clear to me as to why the United States is the world's leading power. You're all aware that the recent Nobel Prize for Economics was given to 3 economists for defining institutions as the key to the cause of successful or failed states. I would venture to add, although I have written nothing on the subject, that this surely applies just as much to national security. The long list of institutions that Professor Rosen has worked for is quite stunning. I wonder how many countries other than the United States has even conducted an integrated study on long-range strategy, as Professor Rosen has for the US. I remember 15 years ago, Andy Marshall invited a whole bunch of Indian strategic thinkers, including myself, to Istanbul to discuss the future of Myanmar as a viable state. Most of us were a bit surprised and we said to ourselves, Myanmar? But then the invitation was for Istanbul. Today, New Delhi is grappling with the possibility of anarchy in Myanmar, 15 years after that discussion took place, and a possible Chinese advance into the Bay of Bengal. To continue, there is in New Delhi much commentary being published on the possible rise of India. Economic planners, who I think have a fair number of institutions in Delhi, they hope that the country will post an unbroken 7 to 8% GDP growth for about 20 years, replicating China's growth 20 years ago. Many numbers are being bandied about, suggesting that by 2047, 100 years after independence, Indian GDP could reach 30 trillion. A number of large banks, the IMF and consultancy firms like McKinsey's have contributed their numbers also. The smallest of these estimates is 19 trillion. So a few of us who write on defense matters have decided to take the cautious route and adopt this figure of 19 trillion. So the economic analysts have had their say. A number of defense analysts have begun to speculate now on what effects this possible economic growth has on national security planning in the next 20-25 years. Nothing has so far come out of government circles. I have written a paper for Naval Headquarters stating that the implications are at the least startling, even if one takes the most modest calculations of 19 trillion. Because this would mean a six-fold increase in the naval budget, as the figures seem to suggest. The big question that arises is, does this mean another Mahanian rise to oceanic supremacy in the Indian Ocean, as Mahan wrote about the rise of Britain as the world's hegemon, based on the rise of the Royal Navy between the 17th and 19th centuries? I wish Professor Rosen could take a stab at it. To move forward from his first book on the Indian military, I can just see the title, India's Maritime Rise by Professor Stephen Rosen. I'm sure it will fly off the shelves. If he could write specifically about naval power, the Indo-Pacific, the Indian Navy, and the competition with China. We are quite clear, and some of us at least, are quite clear in our minds that if we do become the third economic power in the world, a conflict between the second economic power, the third economic power, is too fantastic to contemplate. But how do we present China's hegemonic rise and the clear impression that they have given that they would prefer India in a subordinate role in Asia? The naval planners in Delhi who follow the teachings of Admiral Mahan are only too aware that China actually has a poor maritime geography to exert power in the Indian Ocean. However, taking advantage of this is still an uphill task, as the Himalayan border is still militarily active. And there, the Chinese have the geographical advantage, resulting in the defense budget for half a century being heavily skewed in favor of the Indian Army, who gets 61% of the defense budget to 15% for maritime development. Ideally, what I would like to see is a joint US net assessment study on China 2045, particularly as sounds of trouble are beginning to come out of China regarding the economy. I myself have tried to inveigle a number of Indian economists, but they seem quite happy to be rooted in being experts on the Indian economy, which doesn't suit our purpose. Fortunately, I understand that the interaction between the US Office of Net Assessment and the Indian National Security Council staff has been rejuvenated. And there are at least beginnings of an annual activity, which I think bodes well for this idea. I agree with Harsh that what is required is a whole of government approach instead of creating visions in silos. I'm aware that we are discussing all this in the background of the momentous presidential elections in the US. However, I feel that the strategic visions of Professor Rosen and the American strategists definitely go beyond time frames and definitely go beyond a presidential term. I therefore conclude by saying that I heartily compliment the Professor Sondhi Institute on its choice of Professor Rosen for this award. I'm sure that had Professor Sondhi been alive, he would also heartily approve. Thank you very much for inviting me to make these remarks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And although you have been a bit partisan in asking Professor Rosen to write only on the maritime policy, so I would, but that is fine. I think I think his work on the Indian military perhaps can encompass everything. But let me now invite Professor Rosen for his remarks and. I think war and the future of India is a topic that is, I think all of us are waiting to hear from you, to hear your thoughts, and of course, if you can also deliberate on what are some future possibilities for India, for scholars who are looking at this area, particularly looking at it from an Indian perspective. What are those avenues? I'm sure many of the younger colleagues in the field will benefit greatly from your views. So, sir, over to you.
Thank you so much. Let me say how honored and grateful I am to the Sondhi family, which has shown me great kindness and warmth, and has made me feel as if I were a real part of their community. Let me thank Professor Pant, who, as usual in his acumen, has put his finger on the problem, which is developing a broader and deeper understanding of military affairs, both in India and in the United States. And let me express my thanks to Admiral Menon, from whom I began to learn over 30 years ago, and from whom I continued to learn this morning. I hope you will not be disappointed in my remarks, which in fact do conclude that India's strategic advantage relative to China may in fact lie in the maritime domain. My professional interest in India goes back to the end of the Cold War, 1990, 1991, when that political revolution, coupled with the initiation of economic reforms in India, led me to speculate that India might not only play a dominant role in its own region, but might be a pivotal power globally, and therefore better understanding of India in the United States for the purposes of defense analysis was a crucial matter. And so acting on that hypothesis, I devoted the next 5 years of my life to research and writing on India, on the Indian military. I was very flattered and pleased to hear this morning that my book had received some attention in India among younger Indian scholars. I was paid the highest compliment a scholar can receive when I went to a conference on Indian military affairs, national security studies, and a young Indian scholar asked if he could be introduced to me, and he came up to me and he said, "Professor Rosen, I want to tell you that your book changed my life. I read your book and I decided upon finishing it to devote my entire career to proving that you were wrong." As any good scholar knows, that is the highest compliment a scholar can receive. Not to have other people follow them and copy them, but to have people be challenged by your work and be led to develop their own thoughts in ways which are better than the thoughts which I was able to express. This is the true reward of a scholar and a teacher, to help contribute to the development of research and insight that is better than that which I could produce or the scholar could produce. That is the intent of, so my intent this morning is to continue that process if possible, by discussing the ways in which war has shaped the trajectory of nations over the span of centuries, how the character of war has shaped military power and the uses of military power, and the ways in which the changing character of war has, and I believe will, change the trajectory of India in its region and in the world. India in 1990 decided to prioritize the development of its national economy. That was the strategically wisest decision that India could have made. The Indian economy had to grow in order to give India the ability to have the resources to deal with the challenges it was facing internally and externally. But as Admiral Menon so vividly put it, India is now reaching the point where it may be able to consider what to do with its rapidly growing wealth in the field of military affairs. Because military affairs, happily or unhappily, has shaped the course of history, along with many other things, such as nationalism, demographics, the spread of ideas, and so forth. I do not wish to make a determinist argument that military affairs determines the course of history, but I think it is only honest and reasonable to acknowledge that military affairs and the character of war has played a role in shaping the behavior and influence of countries over time. And therefore, understanding the way in which the changing character of war may enable or disable India in the pursuit of its national and international goals is an appropriate task, not just for soldiers and sailors, as Admiral Menon and Professor Pant put it, but for the Indian educated middle classes and intellectual establishment more broadly. So this dialogue, which deepens and broadens the discussion, is the objective of my work and of this talk today. To make the argument that the character of war has changed the character and trajectory of nations, and therefore may change the trajectory of India, I need to lay out an argument that has 4 parts. The first part concerns something which historians internationally have come to call the revolution in military affairs. Approximately 5 times over the course of history since 1600 in the Common Era, there have been discontinuous changes in the ways in which military power is generated from social resources. These changes have been the result of changes in technology, but not only changes in technology. They've been the result of changes in the character or the organization of military, of armies and navies. And these revolutions in military affairs have had truly revolutionary impacts. They're called revolutions because they have increased the amount of power that can be generated from a given amount of resources by a factor of 10, a genuine order of magnitude increase. And they have increased the ranges at which military power and influence can be exercised, also by a factor of 10. And have on occasion reduced the amount of time that is required to exercise this influence by a factor of 10. Armies have become more powerful, they've been able to reach further, and they've been able to win wars more quickly. Under the circumstances which I will discuss, these revolutions in military affairs, RMAs to call them for short, can be developed by nations that oppose each other symmetrically or asymmetrically. If both parts of a pair of military and political contestation adopt RMAs effectively, the result is stalemate. If these RMAs are adopted asymmetrically, if one side better exploits and develops the capabilities latent in the RMAs, the result is an asymmetric and rapid expansion of the influence and power of the nation that has more properly understood and employed RMAs. So a correct and full understanding and use of RMAs is a big deal. As I will say later, it has had a major impact on the spread of European overseas imperialism, for example. The second part of my argument, the first part of my argument is that there can be revolution in military affairs. The second part is these revolutions can be symmetrical or asymmetrical. The third part of my argument is that RMAs are not the only thing that affect the character of war. The level of social unity or coherence of a society generating military power is also extremely important, not only for the amount of power that can be generated, but the kind and way in which power is exercised. When ideas and shared experiences enable countries with heterogeneous languages, religions, and ways of life, when shared ideas and shared experiences enable these diverse societies to unify, they have been able to act cohesively abroad. Their armies have been cohesive abroad and have been able to stand up and fight in very difficult circumstances. Germany was disunited but became united and produced a united army, which was, for many decades, the fear of the world. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was not able to create a unified army, and it disintegrated. When societies can unify themselves and produce unified armies, they will use conventional military power. When they cannot unify themselves, cannot create unified armies, they don't not only have difficulty projecting power, they themselves become targets of subversion. The internal divisions created by the lack of unity internally creates the opportunity for the kind of politics and warfare that Machiavelli wrote so vividly about in the context of pre-modern Italy, and which Kautilya wrote about in South Asia many centuries before that, and which Kautilya called dark war. There has been a long-term competition between regular warfare and dark warfare or subversion. Both have been used. They have been used often simultaneously, but the balance between the two has shifted. When regular power can be generated and projected, it is used in preference to dark war. But when regular power becomes costly and difficult to exercise, when societies are divided internally, the balance shifts away from conventional warfare between organized armies to a competition in subversion. And it is important to understand both kinds of war and the ways in which both may be employed in the future as they have been employed in the past. Therefore, to understand and anticipate the ways in which wars may affect the future of nations, we must understand both how RMAs are developing and the trends in the coherence, the social unity of rival nations. The interaction between RMAs and social unity or disunity is complex. RMA technologies may empower and enable dark warfare as cyber capabilities enable cyber subversion. Dark warfare may displace conventional warfare when RMA methods make open warfare too difficult and too costly. Societies that can do both, develop RMAs and remain cohesive, can expand at the expense of countries that have not developed RMAs and which have not been able to maintain internal cohesion. This understanding of the interaction of RMAs, social cohesion, and dark warfare, I think, gives us a way to approach the development of an answer to the question, what is the character of the competition between China and India going to look like? If the PRC can gain an asymmetrical advantage over India in military capabilities based on the digital information revolution, commonly referred to as the revolution in long-range precision strike, India's ability to defend its northern border will be seriously degraded. Less obviously, India's fixed military installations, its major military bases, its lines of communication internally will all be vulnerable to Chinese long-range precision strike. They are vulnerable to Chinese long-range precision strike. This includes a threat by China to India's national nuclear deterrent force, both mobile, fixed, and at sea. India's nuclear deterrent must contend with the developing Chinese revolution in military affairs, which gives Chinese long-range precision strike forces greater power. If India can neutralize China's long-range precision strike capabilities and develop India's own precision strike capabilities, the outcome of the competition between China and India will tend towards a stalemate, though the PRC may have advantages over India if it maintains its economic advantage. So the economic competition remains important as well. Second, if the trends in long-range precision strike that could create a stalemate, the trends in long-range precision strike that could create a stalemate on the northern border of India, those trends and technologies also give India the opportunity to use digital information technology and its geographic position in the Indian Ocean area to achieve an asymmetric advantage over China. India has an asymmetrical advantage in geoposition relative to China's maritime lines of communication. If the land military balance is stalemated, the maritime balance, by virtue of the same technologies, may favor India. So India's opportunity against China may be at sea rather than on land. Third, if China is stalemated at the level of conventional war, if conventional war is too difficult or costly relative to India, China will have incentives to exploit the internal divisions within India, as China is currently exploiting internal divisions inside the United States. To deter this, China may wish to develop symmetrical capabilities targeted on Chinese internal divisions and vulnerabilities. Let me back up and give a brief historical review of RMAs to provide a little bit more substance or support for my basic argument. I talked about revolutions in military affairs, RMAs. The first revolution in military affairs took place in the beginning of the 17th century in the Netherlands, a small country that was part of the Spanish Habsburg Empire, much weaker than the Spanish Habsburg Empire militarily, which is why it was part of the Spanish Habsburg Empire. The Spanish Empire had mass peasant armies, large but poorly trained. The revolution, led by Maurice of Nassau in the Netherlands, said, we will take advantage of the literacy and social cohesion of the Netherlands to develop well-trained, disciplined armies utilizing Roman legionary tactics, which created armies that were not mobs of armed peasants, but disciplined soldiers who could maneuver in unison on the battlefield. The modern or early modern drills that permitted soldiers to move and act in ways that supported each other. These armies, which were the product of the first revolution in military affairs, were able to defeat Spanish armies 10 times their size. It was literally an order of magnitude revolution, which enabled the emergence of the political independence of the Netherlands. The set of operational military organization was based on ancient Roman texts. The literary educated class of Europe at that time all read Latin. So the basic ideas of Roman legionary military organization and tactics spread rapidly throughout Europe. The result tended to be symmetrical development of RMAs, which tended to stabilize the existing distribution of political power. This was not true globally. The revolution in military affairs, which gave modern European armies much greater military power from a given number of men, did not immediately spread to South Asia. So the small English armies of the 18th century were able to defeat Indian armies much larger than they were, though the more intelligent British officers, such as Richard Wellesley, realized that the Indians would quickly learn from experience, and therefore England must move rapidly to consolidate its successes in India, because the Indian armies, particularly the armies in Maratha, were rapidly developing the same kinds of capabilities as the English. And once they had mastered the English techniques, the European techniques, the Indian advantage in numbers and political will would clearly be dominant. So the English realized they were in a race for time. In other words, how quickly competitors adopt RMAs matters. It's not just everybody eventually gets it, so it doesn't really matter. The one that does it first can consolidate and lock in a position of advantage. The second revolution in military affairs was driven by steam engines and modern rifled weapons that have spirals on the insides of the barrels, which cause the bullets to spin, which make them accurate at much greater distances. This revolutionized the reach of military organizations. When land transportation was slow and difficult, it didn't make sense to try and move a big army 500 miles. It's too hard. The army would kind of dissipate, would leak out along the way. It was better to take money and send it long distances and use that money to hire local peasants. But when you could move trained troops rapidly by railroads, you could affect military affairs at continental distances. You could move an army 1,000 miles in 10 days. And that trained army that you could move by rail could defeat any local untrained army or massive peasants. So this made possible two things. That railroads made possible the integration of national-sized economies. You could bring together the natural resources and the labor of much larger political entities or social entities to create wealth, and you can move the power generated by these technologies greater distances. The countries that could develop these technologies and use them more rapidly had a big advantage over the ones that did not. And Prussia, which mastered the railroads and rifles more quickly, defeated the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the War of 1866. And Prussia, rather than Austria, became the dominant power in Central Europe. And of course, the Austro-Hungarian Empire eventually collapsed. At sea, the same technology, rifled projectile firing weapons and steam engines, created the revolution in maritime affairs. And the states that mastered it could dominate states that did not at intercontinental distances. The famous or infamous Black Fleet of the United States that steamed across the Pacific to, in American words, open Japan, or from the Japanese point of view, coerced Japan into accepting trade agreements that Japan did not want, because Japan had not mastered that technology. It was the same technologies which enabled the British Navy to easily defeat the Chinese armies in the infamous Opium Wars of the 1840s and 1850s. The third revolution was the internal combustion, aviation, and radio communications revolution of blitzkrieg fame or infamy. You could move troops even faster over roads that did not have railroads by using internal combustion engines. You use aviation to move firepower much more quickly and at greater distances. You could use radios to coordinate all these rapidly moving mobile forces. And the result, as we all know, was the German defeat, the Nazi defeat of France in 6 weeks in May and June of 1940. Though the French army had the same technologies and was larger, but the Germans had better mastered the operational characteristics and techniques of this blitzkrieg revolution. The Germans tried to use the same technologies against the Soviet Union, but the greater size of the Soviet Union gave the Soviet army more time to respond, react, and learn, and by 1942 and 43 was able to field armies which employed the same tactics and capabilities as the Nazis, but with greater numbers. And the result was a slow, grinding push of the Germans out of occupied areas of Eastern Europe. The fourth revolution is famous. I won't spend much time on it. Was the nuclear revolution, coupled with intercontinental ranged forces, which were made possible because nuclear weapons enabled you to send devastating amounts of power in relatively small packages. That was the United States tried to utilize its asymmetric advantage to achieve coercive superiority through massive retaliation in the late 1940s and early 1950s, but the Soviet Union rapidly mastered nuclear weapons technology, and the result, again, was stalemate. Today, we live in the era of the fifth information revolution, created by the utilization of digital information technologies for military purposes. Briefly put, digital information enables sensors to collect data. Digital communications allow you to amass and integrate that information and make sense out of it so that you can find targets around at distances that are independent of range. And you can use digital technology and data processing to provide internal guidance to weapons so that they can update their trajectories after being fired so that their accuracy is independent of their ranges. You can hit a bullseye now at a range of 10,000 kilometers. So what digital technology has done was enable you to find, locate, and designate targets. And what you can find and designate, you can hit. And what you can hit, you can kill. This is the world we're living in today. The United States first displayed these technologies in the Iraq War of 1991. The most avid consumer of information about that war was the People's Republic of China. There was an explosion in publications in China on the subject of the American war in Iraq and the explosion of the discussions about how to counter those new technologies. The issue of finding targets became critical. If you can kill what you can see, seeing things or denying the adversary to see things becomes crucial. Or more properly, information dominance becomes crucial. Seeing things only matters because you understand what they are and where they are. And that's a matter of cognition, information and data processing. The artificial information revolution is changing that by making it possible to process much more information much more rapidly. But the basic physics of observation are constant. It's easiest to see airplanes in the sky because airplanes are big, made out of metal, and are against a background which is free of clutter. That's why stealth technology was so important. Okay? Ships at sea, large magnetic collections of metal weighing over 10,000, 100,000 tons are almost impossible to hide at sea. They will be found and they can be struck and they will be sunk. The United States Navy is now wrestling with the problem of what to do about the vulnerability of its aircraft carriers, which they denied for a period of time, but they can no longer deny. Other ships are equally vulnerable. So the precision strike regime has changed the character of maritime warfare. Targets that are easiest to hide are targets that can be hidden in complex terrain, mountainous terrain, jungle terrain, or urban terrain, where you can hide your military forces in a dense, complex social terrain environment. But other things equal, objects that are bigger are easier to find and to target. Moving long distances requires more fuel. More fuel means you have to be bigger. So there's an advantage to forces that are fighting locally relative to forces that have to move long distances. Moving across the Pacific by sea or by air and remaining undetected is very difficult to do. This is why China has an advantage in the so-called anti-access area denial competition with the United States. Chinese forces are operating locally around the coast of China. The United States has to move 10,000 miles across the Pacific. The United States is now wrestling with how to maintain its military role in the Western Pacific in an environment in which to be seen means to die. We're doing this by pulling large platforms back, dispersing and multiplying military bases on land, and hiding in the jungle or in mountainous terrain where possible. Whether this effort will be successful against Chinese counter-efforts is now a matter of active discussion. But structurally, the United States has a serious disadvantage in the Western Pacific, operating from bases that are far away. On land, we have the ability to observe what is going on in Ukraine. Initially, Ukraine had an asymmetric advantage in digital information technology, both because of indigenous capabilities and because of assistance from the United States. The United States rapidly supplied Ukraine with sophisticated digital technology and short-range precision strike weapons. We all remember the early videos of American Javelin missiles neutralizing large Russian armored columns. Ukraine then developed longer-range precision strike weapons, which struck at Russian strategic bomber bases deep inside Russia. Those long-range drones, which we have seen on YouTube and elsewhere. Those drones may have been launched by Ukrainian forces that infiltrated themselves inside Russia to launch from positions closer to their targets. This is a combination of dark warfare and RMAs. You insert clandestine forces into the rear areas of the adversary so that you can launch drones from closer in. This is not a problem that Russia alone faces. There are drones operating today over American military bases in the continental United States. This digital revolution now is ongoing, and the power that is local has the advantage. Let me now turn to this issue of dark warfare and social cohesion. The military implications of social cohesion still are important, or Machiavelli and Kautilya are still important. When it used to be taught in grammar schools that the Spanish Armada was a fleet of Spanish troops that was going to invade England in the late 16th century and was defeated by the brave English sailors. The Spanish Armada was not really meant to invade and fight England by itself. It was meant to aid English Catholics revolting against a non-Catholic king in England. In other words, it was an external military support to a subversive movement within the target country. The British employed the same tactics against Catholic France. They would send maritime forces to support Protestants in places like La Rochelle in coastal areas in France. In other words, the internal divisions, which were religiously based in the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe, were used as a tool that was aided by conventional military deployments that were smaller, but which could be of decisive help. Okay. But social and political factors emerged. Nationalism became a force in Europe. Nationalism replaced religious divisions with the principle the religion of the king is the religion of the country. There were cultural wars fought in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries to achieve cultural homogeneity and cohesion. Countries that succeeded, like Prussia, were powerful. Those that could not achieve social cohesion, like the Habsburg Empire, failed. The British used the internal divisions in its rivals to achieve advantage in India and in China. But they could not do so against Japan, which had the Meiji Revolution, which created political and social cohesion within Japan and prevented the spread of British or European imperialism to Japan. By the end of the 20th century, multinational empires had largely been replaced by nation states, almost all over Europe. The fall of the Soviet Union, was also the fall of the Russian Empire. The three remaining multinational empires today are China, India, and the United States. We have to remind ourselves that the current boundaries and borders of the PRC are the borders of Qing Dynasty China. The Qing Dynasty creates the current map of modern China, and it was a multinational empire. The Qing were a non-Han-speaking, Manchu-speaking foreign elite, resisted by the poor Han population of the southern coastal areas of China. The PRC today claims that China is 94% Han Chinese. But let me put the following proposition to you. If in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party conquers Qing Dynasty China, which is multi-ethnic, is that going to be revolutionized overnight? You can claim it is, but it is not. And in fact, in moments of honesty, the PRC admits that it remains a multilingual divided empire. Chinese state figures say that in 2004, there were 400 million Chinese who could not understand Beijing dialect Mandarin, for example. The religious and ethnic divisions of India are well known, and the divisions within the United States along class lines are now quite evident. Putin, Xi Jinping, President Modi, Prime Minister Modi, and President-elect Trump all agree on the idea that their countries are multilingual and ethnic, but should be unified civilizational states, to take the term of my teacher, Sam Huntington. States that are unified by a common civilization, which is based in a common set of religious values: Russian Orthodoxy, Confucianism, Hindu religion, and in the United States, Christianity. In some senses, all of these leaders are reacting to the challenges that are created by the diversity internal to their societies to create higher degrees of unity and cohesion out of societies that do have divisions. What does this have to do with the future of war? China and Russia are already using digital information technology to exacerbate internal divisions within the United States, so far with limited success. The PRC today claims that the United States is utilizing digital technology to interfere with Chinese internal affairs by supporting independence-seeking movements in Taiwan, but also elsewhere within China on the mainland. We have seen the internal divisions within Russia being exploited by the Ukrainians. Ukrainian forces have been enabled by Russian supporters inside Russia. And precision strike plays a role in this as well. Okay? As precision strike does what? Symmetrical deployment of precision strike makes it more difficult to project conventional military power. Both sides have precision strike. The result tends to be stalemate. So what does that mean? The relative value of subversion relative to conventional war goes up. Cost of conventional war goes up. The attractiveness of subversion goes up too. Okay? So that utilizing the internal divisions now may be more attractive, particularly when digital information technology can aid internal opponents of your enemy at the same time you're applying external military pressure. All right, to wrap this up, what does this mean for India? On land, long-range precision strike can enable both China and India to isolate the battlefield along the border from forces that are based further back. You do not need to defend the border at the border. If China cannot move forces and supplies to the border because you can strike at targets along the lines of communication deeper inside China, you need to have forces on the border itself goes down. So the development of symmetrical long-range strike forces may go some long way towards stabilizing the border dispute. But Chinese ability to use long-range precision strike to put at risk Indian nuclear forces is a problem that needs to be addressed. Nuclear armed missiles and their bases are large and fixed, in many cases, hard to hide. Missiles moving on roads are also large and hard to hide and easy to find. India needs to be concerned about the long-term viability of a strategic nuclear deterrent. It needs to make sure that there is a symmetric situation where India is not vulnerable and to Chinese attacks. It may also wish to develop its own capabilities to strike deeper inside China. India also has the ability and the incentive to employ dark warfare enabled by digital technology inside China. And at sea in the Indian Ocean, digital technology favors India. The further you must travel at sea, the bigger you must be. The bigger you are, the harder it is to hide. India is operating at shorter distances than the Chinese. It can achieve information dominance in the Indian Ocean. It can deny China the ability freely to move the commerce that China needs to survive unless China desists from engaging in coercive practices against India. In other words, the maritime dimension may be the domain in which India is able to constrain China from acting in ways contrary to Indian national interests. The best way to fight China may not be on land, it may be at sea. To conclude, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, India concentrated its efforts on growing its economy first as did China in the 1980s and 1990s. This was the right decision. But now China is slowing down, India is speeding up, and the competition in military affairs is becoming more demanding, not least in part because of the quasi-alliance between China and Russia. It was a commonplace in the United States until recently that war was obsolete. Uh, Secretary of State John Kerry said that what the Russians were threatening to do in Ukraine was a relic of the 19th century. We had progressed beyond the use of military force for state purposes. This was tragically wrong. War does continue to be relevant to the fate of states and the outcome of international competitions. It is only one dimension of the overall national competition, but it is an important one, and it is made complicated by the issues of technology, social cohesion, RMAs, and dark warfare. So Professor Pant put his finger on it when he said we needed a broader, more broadly informed discussion of strategic competition informed by an understanding of military affairs. That is what I've tried to do in my work in the past. That is what I've tried to do today. And again, I'm profoundly grateful to the Sondhi Foundation, the Sondhi family, and my friends in India for enabling me to become better educated on the subject and to engage with people from whom I can learn and from whom I hope to continue to learn in the future for many years to come. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for this award. I am truly grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rosen. I think it was a masterclass. In 45 minutes, you surveyed so many ideas and concepts. And I think wrapping it up, particularly the challenges that confront India and the international system was very, very useful for a student of international affairs and to understand the challenge of warfare in the contemporary environment, as well as what India can and should be doing and how we should be thinking, both intellectually and operationally about these matters. So thank you for that overview. Let me invite, I think we have a few minutes for some questions, comments, and observations from those who are here. Please raise your virtual hand if possible, and we can have you join this conversation if there are questions or if there are observations that you wish to make. We can perhaps take 10 more minutes for that. And hear everyone out before I hand it over to Shivaji first. And then. So I think Manoj wants to come in. Manoj, you're muted.
Yeah. Thank you. Hello, Steve. It's nice to see you after many, many years.
What a pleasure, Manoj. Yes.
And I was one of the earliest readers of your book. But what I want to understand right now, we have a peculiar situation with China in the sense that in terms of resources, if we have to compete right now, our defense budget is of the order of about $70 to $80 billion. China is about $250 billion, and the United States is about $800 to $900 billion. And China is basically competing with the United States. So that puts a huge amount of pressure on us, meaning what do we do? Meaning whether it's in the area of nuclear. And I think I'm very happy that you have pointed out the challenge that we are confronting in the nuclear area, because that would be vital as a national deterrent to China. But China has been very rapidly expanding its arsenal, and India is not. I don't think we can afford to at this juncture. So I just wonder how this kind of three-way competition can be played out to the benefit of India.
Manoj, you're right. You I think my oldest Indian national security friend. So it is truly a matter of great delight to see you healthy, active, and as challenging and interesting as ever. India does not need to and should not try to match China dollar for dollar, rupee for rupee. It cannot right now. It's a bad use of India's resources. But there are limited reallocations of resources that India might contemplate, which were alluded to by Admiral Menon. The Indian defense budget is heavily skewed towards the army for longstanding political and institutional reasons. Some modest adjustments of that Army, Navy, Air Force split could be quite helpful. India produces BrahMos missiles. They are excellent land attack missiles. They are adaptable for sea attack as well. What you need to make them effective is better information. You need to, as I said before, to be able to collect, process, and disseminate information so that you can direct the missiles that you're already producing at reasonable costs indigenously to attack the targets of concern. So I would, and you are buying from the United States limited numbers of maritime patrol UAVs, which can be used at sea and elsewhere as well. And the price of unmanned vehicles for surveillance purposes is going down as they become mass produced by digital production methods such as additive manufacturing and simply getting the advantages of economies of scale. So the cost dimension is manageable, I think, if you reallocate existing resources to these information, surveillance, and reconnaissance functions, and to increase production of existing strike weapons. The nuclear dimension is complicated. And again, I don't think just because China is moving towards something like 1,000 nuclear warheads, India need not do that. It does need to do a better job of dispersing and concealing its existing nuclear weapons arsenal, which is a matter of engineering. It's a political matter because it involves the use of land. To disperse nuclear forces, you need more land. Land in India is politically charged, or using it for military purposes is not always easy. These are matters not so much of money, but of political will. So if India thinks about how to build a small nuclear force that is survivable because it cannot be so easily located, it will go a long way towards maintaining the survivability of its deterrent. The Indian submarine-launched ballistic missile program is admirable in its ambition. It will compel India to master new technologies. It is not the cheapest way for India to develop a survivable nuclear deterrent. Long-range mobile cruise missiles that can be hidden on land or at sea would be much cheaper. By the way, the dispersal and hiding of nuclear weapons to protect them against a superior enemy force is exactly how the PRC proceeded in the era before it was wealthy. They built these complex networks of underground tunnels and caves in mountainous areas to protect themselves against the Soviet Union and possible US attack. Again, India might learn from them, from the North Koreans, and from the Iranians. So the economic constraint is real, but not necessarily decisive.
I have Yeshi, I think, who wants to come in. Please go ahead.
My question to Professor is, you emphasize so much about the importance of social cohesiveness. But in case of China, the social cohesiveness within China is maintained because of the predominance of the Communist Party, and the Communist Party uses the PLA to coercively suppress the people. So, do you see any in the near future any kind of a major challenge to the supremacy of the Communist Party of China and to that extent PLA, a dominance in the society?
I am not an expert on the CCP or the PLA, but I will note what other people have also observed, which is that Xi Jinping has achieved a higher degree of central control over the CCP than his predecessors did, but he's hanging on by his fingernails. It is difficult for one man to maintain unchallenged control against multiple rival factions within the CCP, each of which has rival factions within the PLA. So I would look for social divisions in China where those divisions exist, and those exist within the party. So I would begin by trying to understand those. I think it's a losing battle to say, well, we're going to help the Uyghurs of Xinjiang against the Han Chinese population. The Chinese Communist Party utilizes the ethnic issue as a way of getting Han Chinese people to unify against these non-Han Chinese peripheral peoples. And they are too weak, the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, to really challenge the dominant core Chinese social system. So you have to go to the Han core. You have to understand what the divisions there are there. Look, it's crazy to think that it's easy to keep 1.3 billion Chinese people aligned on one path. There will always be divisions. There are divisions. There were and are conflicts. We need to understand what they are. And at the very least, engage in activities that make the internal security apparatus of the CCP work harder to maintain existing levels of control. On the Chinese state publications today say that the internal security organs of the Chinese government cost more money than the PLA. Well, that's something which is, if we can make it even harder for the CCP to maintain internal control, if they have to work harder to maintain the existing levels of control, the Chinese people are no worse off, but the Chinese government has less money to spend on external adventures and coercion. There are things like supplying VPNs to enable Chinese people to get around the great cyber wall of China. There are ways of helping Chinese people move their families outside of China, which to allow them to escape state coercion. We have not systematically engaged in a search for these tools, but they are there, and we can utilize them. I realize this is a very preliminary and inadequate response to your question, which is a good one. But I would just, Professor Pant asked me to highlight questions for research and for scholars. Understanding the social divisions within the China, and particularly the divisions within the CCP, which are socially based, is a very fruitful area for study.
Thank you. And if I don't see anyone, I'm going to ask one myself because I know we have to conclude. We have run out of time. Professor Rosen, if one question I'm very tempted to ask in the context of what is happening in the US, and in the sense that a lot of with Mr. Trump coming to office and for some time now, this is not simply Mr. Trump, but ever since Obama administration, we have seen a sense, particularly I think in the Indo-Pacific, where America has this hubs and spokes alliance system, trying to contain China and manage China's rise. I think increasingly there are questions about America's commitment to this part of the world, how long lasting that would be, whether there are going to be challenges coming this way. Of course, at the moment, it looks very, tough, tough line on China by Mr. Trump in his first term, then Biden continuing with that. And Mr. Trump has appointed people which have taken a very strong line against China, in which he's appointing in the second administration as well. But I think this larger question of when you look at the deterrence posture in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, which relies on a strong military presence by the US, are we going to see a weakening of that, given the domestic political contestation in the US around the idea of a Europe of a US projecting power abroad? Is there something that is beginning to change? For example, are we going to should America's partners and allies, of course, they have to share greater burden? I think that is becoming part of the discourse. But are we also going to be concerned, or should we be concerned about America's over long-term commitment to the region, and therefore the deterrence posture in the region will also inevitably change, and some of the changes are visible. But I would just want to hear a bit on the internal challenges, since you have written about it and since you write about it, how that American internal dissension, how that is likely to shape America's posture towards this Indo-Pacific, which is the center of gravity at the moment of global politics.
I will try to be brief in response to a very big question, but a very important question. I don't know what the national security implications of the America First foreign policy doctrine, which has been espoused by President-elect Trump. I don't know what it means yet. The people who use the phrase America First have not specified very much what it means, other than not giving as much military aid to Ukraine. But there is a broader political issue than America First and the Donald Trump movement. There is a growing body of belief in the United States on the left and the right that America's military involvement around the world has been counterproductive. The war in Vietnam, the wars in the Balkans, the wars in the Middle East have all been difficult and costly and don't seem to have made the world better. I do not personally subscribe to this belief, but I would say 70% of people in the United States under the age of 35 basically have this point of view, because that's what they've seen. They've seen American use of military power, which appears not to be productive, is very destructive to other peoples, non-US peoples, and which doesn't get the United States, doesn't provide much in the way of safety or economic advantage to the United States. As I said, I personally disagree with this position, but that's what many people believe. So even if Donald Trump hadn't been elected, there would be pressure on the United States to be less involved globally, militarily, to be less willing to utilize American forces in combat around the world. And American friends like Israel have always based their foreign policy on not asking America to send troops to fight for Israel, because they knew that this would cause divisions. So there's this long-term secular trend towards a smaller American military presence abroad, and less of a willingness to engage in war. Americans are generally, divided. They don't want to see China take over Taiwan, but they don't want to fight a war against China over Taiwan with American forces. So what does that mean? A greater tendency towards transferring and devolving better and more effective military means to people so that they can defend themselves. And there's a number of ways to do that, but that's clearly what has been going on, both in terms of demands for burden sharing, greater willingness to transfer technology, and the like. The big change, which is now being discussed not so quietly in the United States, is what to do about the transfer of nuclear weapons related capabilities. If the United States is not willing or not interested in fighting a war to defend Japan or our West European allies, then the basic premise of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is gone. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty says countries around the world don't acquire nuclear weapons, and in return, the United States will defend you. Well, if the United States is not willing to defend those countries, then its insistence that they eschew nuclear weapons no longer makes strategic sense. And there are quiet discussions among non-official persons about what to do about Japan. Japanese think tank people have said, why doesn't Japan have a relationship with the United States similar to the relationship the United States has with some of its European allies, in which there is American nuclear warheads are provided to allies to be placed on platforms, delivery systems owned by the local national governments. We have American nuclear weapons are in Turkey, American nuclear weapons are in Italy, so forth and so on. Why not have American nuclear weapons on Japanese military systems to improve and enhance Japanese ability to deter Chinese attack, Chinese coercion? Obviously, you can't do that with Taiwan. And so there would be the transfers will be of the kind that massive transfers of drones, sensors, and other kinds of things to make coercion of Taiwan. But the basic trend, which the Trump administration may accelerate, but which might well have happened without under President Kamala Harris, has been a transfer of capabilities to local parties so they can better defend themselves without relying on American assistance. Because of the logic of the first part of my talk, which is it's simply harder for the United States to get to the Western Pacific to defend allies there. It's hard for the United States to get to the borders of Russia to defend allies there. Strategic logic as well as political logic are pushing the United States to a different global military posture. And it's foolish to say this is good or bad. It's what has to be, unless the United States is willing to engage in much greater levels of exertion, spend much more money than it's currently spending, for which there is no appetite in the United States at all.
Thanks. And I think we have one last question, yes, from Ashok. Good.
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Super, thank you. Congratulations, Professor Rosen, and thank you also to Admiral Menon and to your good self, Professor Pant. I'm speaking from Abu Dhabi, where prior to the early 1960s, the currency of use was the Indian rupee that was overstamped with a local designation. So it was here for the first few years that the oil was becoming explored and on tap. Can you please give us your thoughts on the development of the Indian rupee in its multipolar status, or the prognosis, the multipolar prognosis for the Indian rupee, and how it links to India's maritime power?
I will simply state the obvious. I have no competence to answer your question. I'm not at all informed on the subjects of its uses of currency, rupees, cryptocurrencies, RMBs. It's an important issue. The role of the dollar as a global currency is important, but anything I would say would reveal my tragic ignorance on the subject, and so I will ask to be allowed not to answer.
I think that's very gracious and very far too modest. Thank you, Professor Rosen.
Thanks, Professor Rosen. Let me hand the baton to Shivaji, and then I think the vote of thanks to VA.
All I wanted to do was this would be the point in an in-person ceremony where my mother would be handing over this nice trophy and the prize money that goes with it. Instead, we will get them to you partly by kinetic means and partly by digital means. And I think you will really enjoy the trophy. It really is quite, it's transparent, so it doesn't show up as well on Zoom, but it looks very nice when it's actually on your desk. So
It does.
it'll be
Yes,
awesome.
even on video, it looks very elegant.
That was it.
Okay. Thank you so much. I am deeply honored.
Lastly, it's my privilege to give the vote of thanks. So, heartfelt gratitude to all who have contributed to make this event a success. First and foremost, my deepest appreciation to Professor Rosen, the recipient of the Professor Emil Sondhi Prize for International Politics, for his brilliant and thought-provoking lecture. I felt at times I was back in college and in a very good lecture, but not always following everything. So I'm glad this talk has been recorded, and I plan to listen to the YouTube talk again, and I'll distribute it to everyone who took part and those who didn't. And I think everyone will profit from going over your ideas carefully. My sincere thanks to our chief guest, Admiral Menon, for adding stature to the event and his thoughtful remarks, which were a very good segue to Professor Rosen's lecture. My special word of gratitude to Dr. Pant for chairing this event. Harsh has accepted our invitations on several occasions, and it's very nice of him to indulge our requests all the time. Lastly, I would like to thank all our attendees who are joining us from different parts of the world, and to take time off or to make time to join this function and participate and ask questions. And a special word of thanks to Tarun Sagar, who's been running this Zoom meeting efficiently for us and helping us prepare for this event. So I think we should end here, and thank you very much.